Another hit Korean horror thriller, Exhuma. Since its release this year, this movie has consistently topped Korea's box office charts. The plot is not only thrilling and exciting, but the cast also features big names like Choi Min-sik, Kim Go-eun, and Lee Do-hyun. Calling it the best dark horse horror film of the year is not an exaggeration. So, for fans of this genre, don't miss out. Without further ado, let's dive in and watch it all at once. The story begins with a witch named May. After receiving a lucrative commission, she sets off with her assistant Jack on a flight to Los Angeles. It's said that a wealthy American's child has been crying nonstop since birth, leaving many medical experts helpless. Unable to find a reasonable explanation through medical science, the wealthy man, on someone's recommendation, sought help from a specialized group in another country. Thus, May the witch embarked on this commissioned journey. Under the guidance of the wealthy man's butler, May and Jack quickly arrived at a hospital and met the baby, who could only calm down with medication. Having already understood the situation, May wasted no time and softly whistled a few notes, a unique method she used to test for the presence of spirits. If an evil spirit were attached, it would undoubtedly react to the sound. However, after observing for a while, May sensed nothing unusual. Perhaps the situation was far more complex than she had imagined. To be cautious, she asked the family to temporarily leave the room. She then instructed Jack to open their toolkit and take out a talisman, which she placed on the baby's stomach. Jack began reciting incantations while May gently lifted the baby's eyelids to examine his pupils. As the ritual concluded, she asked the family members who re-entered the room whether anyone in the family had experienced similar symptoms, such as the father or grandfather of the child. Hearing this, both the child's mother and the butler were visibly startled, as if May had struck a nerve. Their initial skepticism quickly gave way to a hushed discussion. After some deliberation, they decided to take May and her team to meet the child's father. The group quickly arrived at the client's mansion as the car sped along, where they met the wealthy man named Paul. Paul explained to May that his older brother had suffered from a similar condition and had recently died in a mental hospital. His father also experienced occasional episodes, leaving Paul unsure if it was some kind of hidden hereditary disease. May acknowledged that such suspicion was reasonable. After all, a hereditary illness is a natural conclusion for most people. However, she assured him that this situation was different. From the moment she entered the mansion, May had sensed an invisible shadow oppressing the Paul family's bloodline. This phenomenon, she explained, is typically referred to as Graves' Call. In simple terms, it meant that their ancestral graves had issues. Perhaps an ancestor had become restless or agitated in their tomb and begun to lash out. As a result, the eldest son or grandson of the bloodline was bearing the brunt of this curse. If left unresolved, the family would likely face continuous misfortune. Hearing this, Paul urgently asked what could be done to break the curse. May smiled and replied that resolving such an issue would require hiring specialists because she and her assistant alone could not handle it. The people May needed to find were Michael, a renowned feng shui master, and Kevin, a skilled mortician. The duo specialized in grave relocation and restoration. Michael, with his unique ability to analyze soil by touch and taste, could determine whether a piece of land was auspicious. Kevin, as a mortician, was responsible for organizing funerals and other rituals. Proper ceremonies not only ensured the deceased could rest in peace, but also provided psychological comfort to the family. Over the years, many wealthy individuals sought their expertise in choosing and evaluating burial sites. Of course, not everyone believed in these practices, often dismissing them as superstition. However, as Michael would often say, humans live by the earth, thrive on the earth, and return to the earth in the cycle of life and death. After physical death, the body returns to dust and soil, and he saw himself as a feng shui practitioner who sought harmony between the living and the dead. To those who believed, feng shui was akin to religion and faith. With their professional skills, Michael and Kevin had established successful careers in their field back home. That evening, May, who had just returned to the country, immediately brought Jack to find them. Since they had dealt with each other many times before, after a brief exchange of pleasantries, May got straight to the point and mentioned a high-paying commission from a wealthy American. If they agreed to resolve the matter together, each of them would receive a reward of 500 million Korean won. May also explained the details she had gathered. Although the reward was incredibly high, Michael still asked if they were certain it wasn't a possession. Meanwhile, on the other side, the client Paul's mother, upon learning that her son intended to move the ancestral grave, began persuading him that it was all baseless superstition and unbelievable. However, when an eerie cry suddenly echoed out of nowhere, Paul, his father, and his newborn son all inexplicably burst into tears simultaneously. This incident only strengthened Paul's resolve to move the ancestral grave. So he quickly returned to Korea and met with May and the others. Although Michael agreed to the invitation at the time, he stated that he would decide whether to fully participate only after inspecting the wealthy man's ancestral grave. However, Paul wanted them to proceed directly with relocating the grave or cremating it. His parents and relatives were strongly opposed to the idea, and he had actually returned secretly this time. Therefore, he emphasized that strict confidentiality was necessary after the job was done. Despite Paul's insistence, Michael remained firm on inspecting the site first. The group drove together, heading toward the location of the ancestral grave. After navigating a winding and rugged mountain road and walking a long distance through dense forests, they finally reached an open mountaintop where the long abandoned grave was located. Judging by its state, Paul's family seemed to have never visited to worship or clean it. Michael looked at the grave with a serious expression, squatted down to taste the soil, and then walked to a higher vantage point to observe the surrounding terrain and landscape. Unexpectedly, after finishing his inspection, he turned around without hesitation and walked away. Back in the car, Kevin and the others asked Michael why he refused to take the job. Michael explained that with his 40 years of experience in surveying land, he couldn't make sense of this place, but he was certain of one thing: it was undeniably a cursed and unheard of bad site. If they tampered with a place like this, they would invite misfortune upon themselves, possibly leading to a fate of dying without burial. Hearing Michael's stern warning, the group began to waver. After all, no amount of money was worth risking their lives. However, when they returned, Paul, holding a photo of his newborn child, desperately pleaded with them for help. He revealed that he had already lost 2 unborn children in the past, and this third child, who came with great difficulty, was someone he couldn't afford to lose. Seeing his trembling hands, May suddenly proposed a solution to Michael. She suggested that they could perform a shamanistic exorcism ceremony during the reburial, a traditional Eastern ritual known as shamanism, where they would pray to the spirits for protection. Hearing this, Michael asked, "Do you have to make this money no matter what?" Unable to resist May's and the wealthy man's persistent pleas, the group eventually decided to give it a try. Rich people sure move quickly. Before long, Paul had gathered everything needed for the ritual. Michael specifically instructed him to bring 5 young, strong men who would be ready to break through the tomb quickly when the ceremony started. With everything in place, Kevin began reciting the opening words of the ritual. Jack drummed and chanted the sacred texts, while May slowly moved her shoulders and began performing the shamanism dance. As the ritual proceeded, Paul, the grandson of the deceased, hurriedly grabbed a pickaxe and struck the ancestral tomb 3 times, signaling the official start of the grave excavation. When May struck the prepared whole pig with a knife, the 5 strong men immediately began to dig into the grave. As time passed, a large pit appeared in front of them. After digging for some time, the men finally uncovered the coffin lid, and the ritual quickly came to an end. Michael and Kevin descended into the pit. As soon as they arrived, they felt an unmistakable chill in the air. Without hesitation, the 2 of them began inspecting the coffin. Kevin was surprised to discover that the coffin used by the deceased was made of very precious cypress wood. He pointed out that, in their area, only royalty typically used such a material. Nevertheless, they had to move the coffin quickly. With everyone's help, they managed to lift the coffin onto the truck. Since Paul, the client, didn't plan on choosing a new burial site, they prepared to take it directly to the crematorium for incineration. Michael instructed Kevin to go ahead but cautioned him to make sure no one opened the coffin. Kevin laughed and reassured him, saying, "I've been involved in preparing presidential burials before, so you can rest assured about this." After they left, Michael tossed a coin into the pit. The 5 men who had broken open the tomb then resumed filling the hole. Unexpectedly, a strange scene unfolded. Just as one of the men was finishing up, a snake with black fur on its head slithered up to his feet. Startled, the man immediately struck it with his shovel. As dark clouds gathered and a fierce wind blew, in an instant, the sky became covered with thick black clouds, and a torrential rain began to pour. Michael, who was about to leave, hurried over to Paul's car. He explained that according to their industry's belief, if a cremation occurs on a rainy day, the deceased would not reach a good resting place, which could indirectly affect the prosperity and fate of future generations. Regardless of whether Paul considered this superstition, Michael suggested they temporarily store the coffin in the hospital's morgue and wait for the rain to stop before proceeding with the cremation. Although Paul hesitated a bit, he ultimately agreed. With Kevin's help, a morgue attendant they frequently worked with agreed to store the coffin for them. After the coffin was placed inside, Michael reminded Kevin to keep a close watch and mentioned that he was going to visit a nearby mountain temple to inquire about the situation. With that, Michael left. Not long after, the morgue attendant came to find Kevin, noticing that Kevin hadn't eaten yet. The attendant suggested he go out for a meal, assuring him that no one would come by, so there was no need to worry. Kevin, feeling the pangs of hunger after a long day without food, agreed and went alone to a nearby restaurant to eat. What he didn't expect, however, was that the morgue attendant, seeing the luxury of the coffin, had secretly begun to eye the potential burial items inside. When May and Jack arrived at the morgue, they found that the coffin had already been opened slightly. As the scene shifts, when Kevin and Michael arrive at the hospital room to see May, who is recovering, May, with blood dripping from her nose, tells them that she sensed a super fierce entity had escaped from the coffin. At the same time, in a luxurious mansion in Los Angeles, Paul's father, sitting in a wheelchair, gazes absent-mindedly out the window. Suddenly, a deep voice calls out the old man's name. Upon hearing the voice, the elderly man mutters, "Father," making it clear that the entity that had escaped from the coffin was Paul's grandfather. Unexpectedly, the entity immediately used its supernatural senses to find its son and manipulated him into opening the window. As a light breeze swept into the room, Paul's father slowly turned his head but saw nothing. However, in the reflection of the window, a strange figure appeared. The elderly man, sensing something was wrong, moved to the table and called out for his father. Suddenly, a deep, cold voice echoed in his ear. It complained about how there was so much food around, yet it was cold and hungry, unable to eat anything. Then, the entity reached into the old man's chest and gripped his heart, violently ripping it out, ending his life. With the old man's death, the malevolent spirit turned its attention to Paul's mother. The woman was in her room, dancing along to the movements on the TV, unaware that the evil presence had quietly arrived. Soon, a chilling scream filled the luxurious mansion, lingering in the air. Having learned that the entity escaping from the coffin might be frantically searching for descendants, Michael hurriedly called Paul. At the same time, Michael was quickly heading to Paul's hotel. However, Paul didn't hear his phone vibrating on the table because he was in the shower. Meanwhile, May, Jack, and Kevin were preparing for the ritual. They tied a rope around Jack's body, planning for him to serve as a vessel to call back and capture the spirit of the deceased. Once everything was set, May began striking the gong and chanting prayers, while Jack quickly entered a trance-like state. As he jumped higher and higher, the ritual escalated rapidly. When the object in Jack's hands fell to the ground, Kevin suddenly saw the spirit of the deceased rush into Jack's body. Immediately, Jack seemed to change into a completely different person and viciously lunged at May. Fortunately, Kevin managed to grab him in time. Despite the danger right in front of her, May didn't show fear. Instead, she warned him to resolve any grudges and move on. Unexpectedly, Jack suddenly spoke in the old man's voice, saying he would take all of Paul's descendants with him. Afterward, Jack began vomiting, clearly signaling that the spirit of the deceased had left his body. Meanwhile, in the hotel, Paul finally received Michael's call. Michael informed him that something had gone wrong and that he was on his way. Just then, there was a sudden knock on the door. Paul, intending to go answer it, was shocked when another voice, sounding like Michael's, came from outside. Michael, hearing something was wrong, immediately asked Paul what had happened. Paul, confused, asked why Michael would be calling if he was already at the door. Michael quickly explained that he hadn't arrived yet and urged Paul not to open the door, revealing that Paul's grandfather's coffin had been opened. But the knocking continued, growing louder. Michael told Paul to stay away from the door and move toward the window. In a state of panic, Paul followed the instructions and went to the window. To his surprise, Michael suddenly told him to open the window. As an evil laugh echoed outside, Paul turned around and saw a scene he would never forget. Outside, Michael, with the help of a hotel staff member, was opening the door. But unbeknownst to them, Paul had already been possessed by his grandfather. In a bizarre turn, Paul stood on the table and struck a military pose from Japan's colonial era. He then coughed up blood and collapsed to the floor. Seeing this, Michael urgently urged the staff to call an ambulance. Meanwhile, May and the others had already lifted the coffin into the car. Kevin made a call, urging Michael to get Paul's permission quickly. Only if Paul agreed could they proceed with cremating the remains of the deceased to stop him from continuing to harm others. When the butler arrived at the hotel, Paul had calmed down. However, after drinking several bottles of mineral water, Paul suddenly turned to Michael and spoke in Japanese. Michael didn't understand what he meant, but Paul kept repeating the same phrase. Suddenly, Paul's head twisted around completely, turning all the way behind him, snapping his neck in the process. He collapsed to the ground, dead on the spot. This horrifying sight left Michael in shock. As he looked up, he saw a shadow disappearing in the reflection of the window. Meanwhile, in a hospital in the United States, the nurse who was soothing Paul's child to sleep didn't notice the figure dressed in white appearing on the glass window. With Paul's death and the loss of contact with his parents, Michael, sensing the urgency, managed to contact Paul's aunt through the butler. She was now the only one in the family who could decide to have the coffin cremated. Michael explained everything that had happened and stressed that if they were to protect the baby, the coffin had to be burned immediately. Although the aunt was reluctant to cremate her father, after learning that her grandson was in danger, she hesitated for a moment before reluctantly agreeing to the cremation. With her approval, the group quickly set the coffin, already placed in the furnace, ablaze. Meanwhile, in the hospital in the United States, a dark hand slowly reached out towards the baby. As the contents of the coffin rapidly melted away, Paul's wife arrived at the baby's side and was shocked to find the baby had returned to normal. Thus, although the outcome of the grave disturbance was difficult to accept, it finally came to an end. However, not long after, Michael suddenly received a call from one of the workers who had been involved in the grave excavation. When Michael arrived at the address, he found the man trembling under a blanket. Upon questioning, the man fearfully explained that the reason he had become like this was because he had killed the snake at the cemetery. He then begged Michael to find the snake's body and perform a ritual to release its spirit. Otherwise, he believed he wouldn't survive much longer. Although Michael was reluctant to return to the cemetery, he went alone to help the man. After some time, Michael dug in the area where the grave had been, using his aged body to unearth the tomb. When he found the snake's head, he was horrified to see that it seemed to have a woman's face growing on it. While this startled him, it wasn't the worst part. As Michael continued to dig further down, he was stunned to discover another coffin. Even more bizarrely, the coffin was positioned vertically, something he had never seen in his 40 years of working with graves. Realizing the strange nature of the situation, Michael quickly called Kevin and the others. It didn't take long before they arrived. Looking at the coffin, the group noticed that it was very different from the luxurious one they had previously encountered. This one was rough and ugly, wrapped in strange iron chains. Since this was Paul's family's ancestral grave, they suspected the coffin might contain their ancestors. Michael suggested that they first dig it out and place it in the temple on the mountain, waiting for Paul's aunt to give further instructions. After reaching a consensus, the group worked together to pull the coffin out. However, as soon as the coffin emerged, nearby foxes scattered in fear. Switching scenes, after receiving permission from the only monk at the temple, the group carefully carried the large coffin inside and set up a protective barrier using glutinous rice and horse blood to prevent any further strange occurrences. Not long after, Paul's aunt arrived at the temple upon hearing the news. Michael and the others wanted to know how she intended to handle the situation, but the aunt told them that she had never heard of this coffin. She was certain that the person inside was not one of their ancestors. When Michael and the others asked how she was so sure, she revealed a long, hidden secret about their family. The aunt explained that her father, Paul's grandfather, was actually a notorious pro-Japanese trader during the colonial era. To become a true Japanese, he had abandoned his Korean identity. The gravesite, she said, was chosen by a Japanese feng shui master named Jim, but she couldn't understand why. Despite being a traitor, her father was given such an ominous burial site by the Japanese. Having shared this story, the aunt told Michael and the group to handle the coffin. Since Paul was dead, she promised to pay the agreed-upon fee for the job. Afterward, the aunt left the temple. The next morning, after a discussion, the group decided to take the coffin to be cremated first thing. After a hearty meal, they all found a place to rest for the night. Since May was the only woman in the group, she decided to sleep in the car for the night. Taking advantage of the solitude, she reached out to her sister, who was also a witch, to ask if she had ever heard of a Japanese feng shui master named Jim. Her sister replied that during the colonial period, her mentor had encountered Jim. She described him as being surrounded by an aura of malevolent energy, a powerful figure in the world of the occult. Hearing this, May suddenly felt a sense of unease, realizing something was amiss. After ending the call, May muttered the word, "grandmother," under her breath. As soon as she spoke, an old figure suddenly appeared behind her, casting a chilling presence. That night, Kevin and Jack, who were fast asleep, both experienced sleep paralysis. In a dazed state, Jack saw a monk from the temple standing on top of him. Unable to move his body, he struggled to write a scripture with his fingers. Fortunately, he woke up shortly after. Jack understood that the monk wouldn't appear in his dream without reason, so he got up to check. However, after searching around the temple, he couldn't find the monk. Finally, he checked the lock on the warehouse where the coffin was kept and decided to return to rest. At that moment, a chilling sound suddenly came from a barn next to the temple. As Jack slowly walked over and peered through a hole in the wall, he was horrified to see several pigs torn apart on the ground, with what seemed to be a person struggling nearby, suspended in the air by something. Faced with such a terrifying scene, Jack immediately ran back to the temple without looking back. What he didn't know was that, on his way back, the monk's body was also torn open and thrown into the vegetable garden. After returning, Jack immediately woke May, and the two of them went to the warehouse where the coffin was kept. They saw that the horse blood and glutinous rice had not been disturbed, but the lid of the coffin had mysteriously cracked, and the iron chains around it had fallen off. Upon seeing this, May looked up and noticed that the ceiling of the warehouse had a large hole, as if something had broken through the coffin lid and flown out. Realizing the severity of the situation, she told Jack to hurry and wake the others. Left alone, May slowly approached the coffin, and then she pulled something out. Upon closer inspection, it was a samurai helmet. Before May could think about what was happening, a loud, powerful set of footsteps suddenly came from the door. Then May saw a giant dressed in medieval Japanese armor appear before her. Upon seeing May, the giant immediately asked if she was human. Reacting quickly, May knelt down and lied in Japanese, claiming she was not human, but one of his subordinates. The giant, after hearing this, asked if she had prepared silverfish and cantaloupe. Although May didn't understand what this meant, she nervously said she would prepare them soon. Unexpectedly, the giant stopped responding. When May slowly looked up, she heard him say, "So you are human after all." Realizing she had been exposed, May bolted out of the warehouse. The sound of the giant chasing after her grew louder. At a crucial moment, Jack arrived just in time and blocked the giant with an iron rod. When May turned around, she saw that the creature standing before them was an enormous monster. Jack urged May to run, but just then, the giant grabbed her head with one hand. With a fearful expression, May watched as the sharp dagger was driven into Jack's abdomen, and he quickly lost consciousness. After Jack was thrown to the ground, the monster prepared to attack May. At that moment, several loud rooster crows suddenly echoed from a distance. Along with the crowing, the monster clasped his hands together and began chanting Japanese scriptures. Then, flames suddenly surrounded his entire body. When Michael and Kevin arrived, they saw that the monster had already turned into a huge ball of ghostly fire and shot up into the sky. Soon after, the ghost fire disappeared into the horizon. May hurried over to check Jack's injuries and rushed him to the hospital. As Jack was undergoing emergency treatment, the tragic events at the temple quickly made the headlines. However, the authorities determined that the culprit behind it all was a wild bear from the mountains. While waiting outside the operating room for Jack, May told Michael that the creature wasn't a ghost or a spirit, but an elf. Michael was confused and asked what an elf was. May explained that her grandmother had once told her that an elf is a soul, either of an animal or a human, that attaches itself to something, forming this creature. Due to the very harsh conditions for its existence, once it appears, it is almost impossible to destroy. May then began to share some secret knowledge she knew with Michael. Soon after, Jack was no longer in life-threatening danger, but he remained in a coma. May brought her sister and niece to help take care of him, while Michael, using the information May provided, uncovered some hidden facts. It turned out that, during the colonial period, Japan had sought to cut off the fate of the Korean peninsula and ensure it would never rise again. They hired feng shui masters and drove many iron stakes into the country's vital points. When members of an iron-blooded group learned about this, they spontaneously organized to find the locations of these iron stakes and prepare to remove them. While in the temple, Michael discovered an iron pickaxe that had been used by the iron-blooded group, which had strange markings on it. He deduced that the place where Paul's ancestral tomb was located might be where the iron stakes were buried. It made sense why Paul's grandfather, as a pro-Japanese trader, would be buried there. To verify his guess, Michael returned to the cemetery alone. If he could really dig up the iron stakes, it would be a great benefit for the country and its people. However, what he didn't expect was that, after digging for a short while, he was suddenly frightened by an unexpected sight. The monster that had flown away the previous night had somehow returned, and it was now asleep. If it had been awake, Michael surely wouldn't have survived. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Jack suddenly opened his eyes, but as soon as he spoke, he called out for his master. May asked him who his master was, and Jack coldly replied, the one who became a god after slaying 10,000 people. When Michael returned, he learned that Jack had been possessed by an evil spirit. He then shared his findings, including the iron stakes that were placed to control the nation's fate. However, Kevin didn't want to go anywhere near pulling out the iron stakes, as everything that had happened so far had already scared him. He didn't want to provoke any more elf-like monsters. But Michael insisted that they weren't doing this for themselves, they were doing it for the future generations. If they didn't act, who would bring an end to all of this? Moreover, Michael suggested that perhaps if they removed the iron stakes, Jack might be saved. After a strong persuasion from Michael, May and Kevin finally agreed to go along with the plan. At this point, May also shared her theory. She suggested that the reason the monster was guarding the pit might be to protect the iron stakes. Although she didn't have a way to eliminate the monster, she proposed that they could first lure the creature away and then seize the opportunity to remove the stakes. Later, when medical staff came to change Jack's bandages, May suddenly noticed that the monster seemed to avoid the scriptures on Jack's body. The creature had still attacked him, which meant that if the monster disliked the scriptures, they could use this to their advantage. With everything in place, the three of them used brushes to write traditional Chinese scriptures all over their bodies. May left her sister and niece to continue watching over Jack while the others hurried to their destination, preparing everything before nightfall. May remembered that the monster wanted silverfish and cantaloupe, so she planned to use these items to lure it into the forest. At the same time, they had prepared a large bucket of horse blood just in case. As long as Michael and Kevin could find the iron stakes during this time, they would use the horse blood to clean and destroy them. As night fell, the group, now ready, waited quietly for the monster to take the bait. Lured by the silverfish, it wasn't long before a massive hand emerged from the ground. At the same time, Jack in the hospital suddenly began to react. He was moving his mouth as if chewing something. Meanwhile, after eating a silverfish, the monster finally crawled out of the pit and, following the bait set by May and the others, walked deeper into the forest. Seeing its figure disappear, Michael and Kevin immediately rushed toward the pit to search for the iron stakes. However, after eating several silverfish, the monster suddenly stopped. To give Michael and Kevin enough time, May hid in the shadows and, using Japanese, disguised herself as the monster's kin, intending to stall it with communication. This trick actually fooled the monster, which took May for a tree spirit. Meanwhile, Michael and Kevin had been digging for a long time, but couldn't find even a trace of the iron stakes. May, however, had talked too much and was soon seen through by the monster. As it stepped closer to her, ready to rip out her heart, May's grandmother's spirit suddenly appeared behind her. Taking advantage of the confrontation, May quickly ran out of the area. Just as May had barely gone a short distance, she ran into Kevin, who had come out to check. Before they could speak, the monster transformed into a ball of ghostly fire again and rushed toward the sky. Realizing it was about to return to the pit, Kevin immediately sensed the danger, but it was too late to warn Michael. The ghostly fire moved too quickly. Soon, the fire flew back into the air above the pit. Seeing this, Michael suddenly realized that the so-called iron stakes might actually be the monster itself. As the ghostly fire circled in the air, it spotted Michael and immediately dove down toward him. Kevin, startled by the sight, lost his composure, not wanting to see his old friend die just like that. However, after the fire dissipated, Michael didn't die immediately, but it seemed as though he was no longer fully conscious, almost as if trapped in a hallucination. Like it did to Jack, the monster sank its claws into Michael's body. It seemed the monster intended to turn Michael into its puppet as well. At the crucial moment, Kevin and the others rushed back just in time. Without hesitation, May threw the prepared bucket of horse blood onto the monster. The creature immediately recoiled in pain. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Jack suddenly began to emit white smoke, writhing in agony. As May and the others prepared to check on Michael, the monster, reacting quickly, grabbed both of them by the necks and lifted them into the air. Just as it seemed they were about to be strangled to death, Michael suddenly noticed that the monster's helmet seemed to be partially melted by the horse blood. At that moment, he also recalled the diagram of the 5 elements used by the iron-blooded group when searching for the iron stakes. Using the horse blood and the iron pickaxe engraved with ancient script, Michael swung the pickaxe and struck the monster's foot with all his strength. Seizing the opportunity, Michael enchanted the iron pickaxe once more and relentlessly swung it at the monster. A miraculous scene unfolded. The monster was struck so hard that it knelt on the ground, unable to stand. Despite being pierced through, Michael also struggled to maintain his footing, but he endured the pain and once again used the horse blood on his body to enchant the pickaxe. This time, with no surprise, one powerful strike shattered the monster's upper body. With the monster's death, Jack in the hospital suddenly vomited a mouthful of black blood and finally regained his normal state. Afterward, Michael was urgently rushed to the hospital, but with such severe injuries, neither May nor the others knew if he would survive. As the scene shifted, fate ultimately favored the stubborn old man, and he was fortunate enough to survive. Jack's body had also healed to the point where he could get out of bed and walk again. The group stayed in the hospital for a while longer until they were all completely recovered and eventually returned to their normal lives. Although they resumed their everyday routines, the events of that ordeal left a lasting psychological scar on everyone. Each person would often find themselves haunted by memories of the terrifying experiences they had endured. One day, after a long time, the group reunited once again. It turned out that Michael had invited them to attend his daughter's wedding. Seeing Michael tear up with emotion, May and the others were genuinely happy for him. However, what they didn't know was that Michael had fought so hard to survive, primarily for this wedding. Based on his observations in recent times, he had realized that his health might not last much longer. So, during the family photo session, Michael eagerly invited May and the others to join in the picture. May hesitated, saying it wasn't appropriate, but Jack remarked that they were already family. With that, the film came to a close. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.